For 50 years, the world's most famous jazz legend Louis Armstrong lived a double life, and nobody noticed. During the day he was on stage, the Satchmo that millions applauded. But at 2 in the morning, in his luxury hotel room, playing his trumpet in silence, nobody knew what he was doing. His assistants stood guard at the door. Even his family couldn't enter. What Louis did in those rooms was his career's biggest secret, and this secret remained hidden for 50 years. From 1918 to 1971, every night, in every city, after every concert, Louis Armstrong would disappear. He would smile for a moment backstage, then retreat to his room and vanish until dawn. So what was Louis doing at midnight, and why did he never tell anyone? The answer will reveal one of music history's most surprising and inspiring stories. But to understand what happened in those secret midnight hours, we need to go back to where it all began, not to Louis's childhood in New Orleans, but to a moment just weeks before his death, when the truth almost came out. If this story has caught your attention, please subscribe to our channel, because what you're about to discover will change everything you thought you knew about success, dedication, and the price of greatness. July 1971, New York City. Louis Armstrong was 70 years old, his heart was failing, and his doctors had ordered complete rest. He was confined to his home in Corona, Queens. His wife, Lucille, watched over him constantly, making sure he followed doctor's orders. No trumpet, no performances, no late-night sessions, just rest. But on the night of July 3rd, Lucille woke up at 2:30 in the morning and realized Louis wasn't in bed. She found him in his study, sitting at his desk with hundreds of papers spread around him, wearing headphones, listening to recordings of his own performances from the 1920s. He was taking notes, analyzing his own trumpet playing from 50 years earlier, still trying to improve. "Louis, what are you doing?" Lucille asked. "The doctor said you need rest." Louis looked up at her with those tired, gentle eyes. "Lucille, I've been resting my whole life during the day. The night is when I really live." That statement shocked Lucille because after 42 years of marriage, she realized she still didn't fully know her husband. She knew Louis the performer, Louis the public figure. But there was another Louis, a Louis who lived in the shadows, who worked when others slept, who pushed himself beyond any reasonable limit. And this other Louis had existed for 50 years, hidden from the world, hidden even from those closest to him. 3 days later, on July 6th, Louis Armstrong died in his sleep. The world mourned the loss of a legend, but nobody talked about the secret that Louis had carried to his grave, the truth about what made him truly great. Nobody knew about the midnight sessions, the obsessive practice, the relentless self-improvement that never stopped. Because Louis Armstrong's success wasn't just talent, it was a 50-year commitment to a double life that nobody saw. The information in this video is compiled from documented interviews, archival news, books, and historical reports. For narrative purposes, some parts are dramatized and may not represent 100% factual accuracy. We also use AI-assisted visuals and AI narration for cinematic reconstruction. The use of AI does not mean the story is fake. It is a storytelling tool. Our goal is to recreate the spirit of that era as faithfully as possible. Enjoy watching. To understand Louis's secret double life, we need to go back to 1918 to New Orleans to a 17-year-old boy who had just been released from the colored waif's home. Louis Armstrong had spent 18 months in that reform school for a teenage mistake that could have ruined his life. Instead, it saved him. At the waif's home, music teacher Peter Davis had put a cornet in Louis's hands and taught him not just how to play, but how to work. Peter Davis was a strict disciplinarian who believed that talent without discipline was worthless. He made Louis practice for hours every day, made him understand that greatness required sacrifice. When Louis was released in 1913, he carried Peter Davis's lessons with him, but he also carried something else, a deep fear that if he stopped working, he would end up back in poverty, back in that world of hunger and desperation. So in 1918, when Louis started his professional career playing cornet in Kid Ory's band, he made himself a promise he would outwork everyone. During the day, Louis played wherever he could find work, riverboats, dance halls, funeral parades. But at night, after those performances ended, Louis would go home and practice for hours more. His neighbors complained about the noise. His friends thought he was crazy. "Louis, you already played all day. Why are you practicing at night?" Louis's answer was always the same. "Because I'm not good enough yet." And that belief, that he was never quite good enough, would drive Louis for the next 50 years. It wasn't insecurity. It was a conviction that excellence required constant effort, that the moment you stopped pushing yourself was the moment you started dying as an artist. In 1922, Louis got the call that would change his life. King Oliver wanted him to come to Chicago. King Oliver was Louis's mentor, and playing with his band was the opportunity Louis had dreamed of. He moved to Chicago and immediately became the star with his innovative trumpet playing. But what audiences didn't see was what Louis did after the shows. While other band members went out to clubs and parties, Louis went to his boarding house room and practiced until dawn. He worked on technique, on tone, on new approaches to melodies. He pushed his lips until they bled, then pushed them harder. King Oliver noticed and confronted him. "Louis, you're going to destroy yourself. You need rest." But Louis just smiled and said, Joe, I got a long way to go still. Great don't happen with 8 hours of sleep." In 1924, Louis moved to New York to join Fletcher Henderson's orchestra, and his double life intensified. New York was the big time. Bigger stages, bigger pressure. Louis felt he had to prove himself as a representative of New Orleans jazz. So while other musicians socialized, Louis locked himself in his hotel room and worked. His roommate, saxophonist Coleman Hawkins, would later describe those years. "Louis never stopped. I'd wake up at 3 a.m. and he'd be sitting by the window with a muted trumpet, working on some phrase. I asked him why he didn't sleep, and he said, 'Sleep is for when I'm dead, Hawk.'" Do you think this kind of dedication is inspiring or concerning? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. But Louis's relentless schedule was taking a physical toll. By 1925, his lips were constantly swollen from overplaying. His doctor told him he needed to rest or risk permanent damage. Louis ignored the advice. Instead, he returned to Chicago and began recording the Hot 5 and Hot 7 sessions, recordings that would revolutionize jazz. Between 1925 and 1928, Louis recorded some of the most important music in jazz history. Critics called this Louis's genius period. But what they didn't know was that this genius was the result of hundreds of midnight sessions where Louis worked out every phrase before ever entering a recording studio. Louis's first wife, Lil Hardin Armstrong, was one of the few people who understood his double life. She would later write, "Louis was the kindest man I ever knew, but he was also a prisoner of his own ambition. He couldn't stop working. I think he believed that if he stopped, even for a moment, everything would disappear. So he kept going, night after night, year after year, pushing himself beyond what any human should endure." If you're enjoying this deep dive into Louis Armstrong's hidden life, please subscribe. There's so much more to this story. By the 1930s, Louis Armstrong was an international star. He toured Europe, recorded prolifically, appeared in films. But his double life continued. In Paris, in London, in Amsterdam, wherever Louis performed, he returned to his hotel and worked for hours more. His manager, Joe Glazer, tried repeatedly to get Louis to slow down. "Louis, you're making great money. You don't need to kill yourself." But Louis would just laugh. "Joe, I got a lot more music in me. Can't let it go to waste." Joe eventually stopped trying to change Louis's habits and instead made sure Louis had the resources he needed. The physical problems came frequently. In 1935, Louis collapsed backstage after a performance. His lips had split open from overplaying. Doctors ordered 3 months' rest. Louis rested for 3 weeks, then returned to performing and his late-night sessions. In 1939, Louis was in a serious car accident. He suffered cracked ribs and a concussion. Doctors said he should cancel his tour. Louis performed that night with his ribs wrapped, then spent the early morning in his hotel room working on new arrangements. His friend Pops Foster recalled, "Louis was the toughest man I ever knew. Not tough in a mean way, tough in a determined way. Nothing could stop him from playing, from practicing, from improving." But Louis's relentless schedule wasn't just about ambition. There was something deeper driving him, something that went back to his childhood in New Orleans, to those years of poverty and hunger. Louis carried a fear that many people who grew up poor never fully lose, the fear that it could all disappear at any moment. Every night when Louis practiced, he wasn't just improving his skills. He was also proving to himself that he was still worthy, still valuable. It was as if Louis believed that the moment he stopped working was the moment the universe would send him back to where he came from. This fear was irrational. By the 1940s, Louis was wealthy and secure, but childhood trauma doesn't respond to logic. The 1950s brought new challenges. Rock and roll was emerging, and jazz was losing popularity. Younger critics accused Louis of being old-fashioned. These criticisms hurt Louis deeply. But instead of changing his style, Louis doubled down on his work ethic. The late-night practice sessions intensified. Louis worked on his tone, trying to maintain the power he'd had in his youth, despite being in his 50s. In 1959, Louis suffered a major heart attack while on tour in Italy. Doctors told him his performing career was over. Louis spent 6 weeks recovering, then returned to performing and his midnight sessions. When asked why he didn't retire, Louis said, "Retire to what? Music is not what I do, music is what I am. You don't retire from being yourself." The 1960s brought Louis' greatest commercial success and his most severe health problems. In 1964, Hello Dolly became a #1 hit, making 63-year-old Louis the oldest person to top the charts. But behind the scenes, Louis' body was breaking down. His heart was weak, his kidneys were failing, and his lips were so damaged that every note caused pain. Doctors and his wife, Lucille, begged him to rest. But Louis continued, driven by that same force that had compelled him for 50 years. In 1968, Louis was hospitalized with serious heart problems. While in the hospital, he snuck a practice mute into his room and worked on trumpet exercises when nurses weren't watching. Louis' doctor, Alexander Schiff, had a conversation with him about why he couldn't stop working. Dr. Schiff later recounted, "I asked Louis why he pushed himself so hard. He had already proven everything." Louis got quiet, and then he said something I'll never forget. "Doc, I'm not trying to prove anything to other people. I'm trying to prove something to that scared little boy from New Orleans who thought he'd never amount to nothing. Every night I practice, I'm telling that little boy, see, you made it." That's when I understood. Louis wasn't working for the future. He was working to heal the past. What do you think drove Louis more? Ambition or healing? Share your perspective in the comments. This is the secret that Louis Armstrong carried for 50 years. His double life wasn't about perfectionism or even love of music. His double life was about survival in a deeper sense. Emotional survival, the survival of his sense of self-worth in a world that had tried to tell him he was worthless. Every midnight session was Louis telling the universe, "I matter, my music matters." Every hour of practice was defiance against poverty, against racism, against all the forces that tried to keep him down. And every morning when Louis woke up exhausted but ready to perform again, he was proving to himself that he had won. In his final months in 1971, Louis' body finally gave out. He was confined to home, unable to perform, barely able to walk. But even then, the double life continued. Lucille would find him at 2 a.m, listening to old recordings, taking notes. "What are you looking for, Louis?" she asked him one night. Louis looked at her with those tired, kind eyes and said, "I'm looking for the moment I became good enough, because I still haven't found it yet." Lucille started crying because she finally understood. After 50 years of unprecedented success, Louis still didn't fully believe he deserved it. The scared little boy from New Orleans was still inside him, still doubting, still afraid. Louis Armstrong died on July 6, 1971 at 4:48 in the morning. His last words were, "I'm home." But here's what the world didn't know, what wasn't. Discovered until decades later when researchers went through Louis's personal papers. On the night before he died, Louis had written one final note to himself. It was found tucked inside his trumpet case, written in shaky handwriting on the back of an old concert program. The note said, 50 years, still not good enough, but maybe tomorrow. There would be no tomorrow, but that note revealed everything. The relentless drive, the impossible standards, the beautiful tragedy of a man who gave the world so much joy while denying himself the one thing he desperately needed: permission to rest, permission to believe he had done enough. The world saw Louis Armstrong smile and assumed he was happy. They saw his success and assumed he was fulfilled. They saw his talent and assumed it came naturally. But Louis Armstrong's real story, the story of those 50 years of midnight sessions, of bleeding lips and exhausted bodies and a fear that never quieted, that story died with him. Until now. Because the greatest lie we tell ourselves about legends is that they were born great, that success came easily, that genius requires no suffering. Louis Armstrong's double life proves otherwise. Greatness isn't a gift. It's a choice made every night at 2 a.m. when the world is asleep and nobody's watching. It's the decision to practice when you're already exhausted, to improve when you're already the best, to prove yourself when you've already won. And sometimes that kind of greatness comes at a cost that nobody sees until it's too late. 50 years, 2 lives, 1 man. The world got the music, Louis carried the weight. And on that final morning in July 1971, when Louis Armstrong took his last breath and whispered, "I'm home," he wasn't talking about heaven. He was talking about finally, after 5 decades of running, of working, of proving himself to a ghost that would never be satisfied, he was finally allowing himself to stop. The double life was over. The scared little boy from New Orleans could rest, and somewhere in the universe a trumpet fell silent, not because the player had failed, but because he had finally, impossibly, heartbreakingly done enough.